Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust. Okay, for today's interview, I'm going to be speaking with an archaeologist who you may recognize from book sleeves or documentaries or television programs. Now, he hasn't brought his sash or tiara today, but many people would actually know him as Mr. Stonehenge because that's a site he's very much associated with, and that would be Mike Parker Pearson. Now, this interview will start where most good interviews should, which is with outrageous flattery. I had the privilege of taking an Iron Age Europe course with Professor Parker Pearson last year, and I actually had been inspired to make a career change into archaeology from watching some of those TV shows. Now, as part of that course, he took us on a tour of the British Museum, the Iron Age galleries. And I was recounting this to an old friend of mine who I went to grad school with. And, he asked me how it went. And I reminded him of a story back when we went to, grad school together a long time ago. Now, that course of study was military strategy and intelligence. And one of our professors at the time was the former director of the CIA. He brought us on a tour of the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., where we were studying, and we were all kind of enthralled. And leading the tour was not only the former director, but the spy who's helped smuggle Stalin's daughter out of India during the Cold War. So I reminded my friend of that when he asked me how the gallery at the British Museum went, and I said it was kind of like that, being led around by the people who lived it. So how's that for flattery? Without further ado, Mike Parker Pearson, thanks for agreeing to speak to me today, Mike.
That's great. Yes, I've been to the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Great fun.
And that's all real stuff. They had those, dragonflies with recording devices that listened in on Soviet spooks. So We heard it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Well, you have had a very long career in archaeology. It's been about 50 years now.
It hasn't, is it? Yeah, well, it probably has. Yes, and my first dig was 1972, a rescue excavation in advance of the M5 motorway. So, in a way, everything kind of, for me, started then. I was still at school. And by the time I went to university, which was 1976, I'd already become, very much a field archaeologist. So, early days.
And what first got you into archaeology? Were your parents supportive of it, or?
My parents were perfectly happy that I did that. My school teachers were not. This wasn't a proper career as far as they were concerned. I was told to get more interested in studying law or business management. What really started for me, though, was a very, very young age. I was only 4 years old, and my parents had bought a field in which my father had built the house, and it was a delivery of gravel for the driveway that I noticed that it was full of fossils. At 4, of course, I didn't really know what fossils were, but I was just entranced by the curious shapes. And I can remember particular ones that we call belemnites, which those sort of pointy-shelled nautilus-type creatures. And I thought those were bullets, that they were prehistoric bullets. Now, how at 4 years old did I even have a conception of a bullet? I really don't know. I've never worked that one out. But that was the beginning. And thereafter, I think it was then seeking out things in the library. And from the age of 6, it was, I can still remember the book. It was called Fun with Archaeology. Very simple stuff, but it really drew me in. We don't often have an awful lot of fun with archaeology these days, as we ought to.
Now, you went to university undergrad where?
So I was an undergrad at Southampton, and the professor there was Colin Renfrew, who, of course, was the greatest British archaeologist of his time. And I was very lucky that around him there was a group of very young, dynamic teachers. One of them, my colleague still here at UCL, Professor Stephen Shannon. And they were absolutely inspiring. And I think we were going through a theoretical revolution with the new archaeology that had reached these shores from North America. So it was a really extraordinary time, and I was just so lucky to be in that university at that point. For the choice of university, I didn't know that as an applicant, and I think it was really luck rather than good judgment.
Now, something that was extraordinary, which we were just chatting about, is then, of course, you went on to do your PhD. And having worked with Renfrew, now I haven't discussed theory in detail on this channel yet, but Renfrew was sort of the godfather of British processual archaeology, which is very scientific based. That was something that was a transition as a reaction to culture history. And then at Cambridge, you worked with Hodder, Ian Hodder, who sort of birthed a new form of theoretical school called post-processualism. So it's kind of like you worked with both camps. What was that like?
Yes. In the space of 4 years, I went through 3 paradigms: culture history, the new archaeology or processual archaeology, and then post-processual archaeology. And I think for choosing where to do my PhD, it was that Ian was really thinking in completely new directions. And that was a very exciting time, that everything was once again thrown into flux. Ian was inspirational in his own way, that he wasn't a great pounder on the table and saying, this is how it will be. He actually had a lot of doubt, and he would change his mind every seminar that we had. So we were kind of moving in all sorts of experimental directions. But I think what was very useful was that, of course, this was in Cambridge, and the revolutions that would become broadly postmodernism were all underway in the other disciplines, in geography and philosophy, history to some extent, philosophy of science. So it was realizing that this was actually a well-trodden path in the other social sciences. And archaeology was, as usual, coming to the party just a few years too late. But we soon caught up. And after several years of very antagonistic dealings with fellow archaeologists, particularly those in North America, it finally became an established paradigm within the discipline. But there were a lot of very ugly fights, and my colleague Chris Tilley, who's just died very sadly, he was very much caught up in those. And I know he felt, he was very badly treated, mauled in the reviews that came out of his books at that time.
Yeah, he was a leading figure in post-processualism too, and carrying that forward. How did you navigate those waters, having relationships all over the place?
Well, I think for me the important thing was how did it work in practice? I had a very solid practical background in excavation and fieldwork. And I think for me it was always, well, how can we actually get this to work for us to understand the past better? And the other point, I think, was Ian immediately said, right, I know you want to do your degree on the Bronze Age of the Alps. Forget it. I'm going to give you a topic, and the topic is mortuary practices, funerary archaeology, and I want you to go out and conduct ethnoarchaeological studies of the present day, because we need to rewrite the relationship between material culture and human behavior. And this is how we're going to do it, because we're going to see how meaning is so intrinsic to understanding that relationship. So completely recasting Binford and Schiffer's ideas of middle range theory to take it in a different direction. And again, that was important because it gave me a a way in by choosing a particular topic. And he was very clever because he actually said to each of his students, you do this topic. So someone else did refuse and trash management. Someone else did pottery designs. So it was taking aspects of material culture and then working them through, and ultimately, whether it was ethnoarchaeological, if possible, to start developing actual empirical studies to follow the research through.
And this is very timely because actually last week on the show I covered ethnoarchaeology. Is this how you got into Madagascar?
Yes, it was unfinished business because my initial thought was to go and work somewhere where there were traditional burial practices, and one of those would have been Kenya, where other of the Hoderites, as we became known, others went to study. But my interest then moved towards Borneo. The political situation wasn't particularly conducive, and that never came off. And in retrospect, I'm very glad, because after that I thought, well, let's just go straight into the archaeology. Where's the evidence best? Where are archaeologists doing the best job with prehistoric sites? And the answer there was Denmark. So I was able to go straight into an empirical study for the PhD. But it was that feeling that although I'd done an ethnoarchaeological study in Cambridge itself, working with undertakers and finding out about how the rich and powerful actually had the simplest and cheapest funerals, that we had an inverted relationship, unexpected. It was that feeling that there was always a wider study waiting to be done. So what happened in the late 80s, I'd taken a job in 84 with English Heritage, the government organisation for preserving ancient monuments. And while working there in central London, the adjacent museum to our office in Savile Row, where the suits are from, was the Museum of Mankind, and they were putting on an exhibition on death rituals in Madagascar, which was just stunning. And I said to my girlfriend, who would become my wife years later, wouldn't it be amazing to go? Thinking, this is so far away. How do you get there on some kind of tramp steamer or whatever? Not thinking that we lived in a joined-up world of air travel. And she said, "Yes, why not? Let's do it." Wow. And that really was a formative moment, because I think it was the amazement and the sheer terror of just landing in a very different society, no knowledge of the language, and just wondering how on earth we were going to spend the next month. Should we just hide in our hotel room in the capital and then come back pretending we'd been around the country? But we girded our loins, we decided, we got brave, and off we went. And we had the most amazing time. We met extraordinary people, and they said, "Oh, come to our funeral, come to our memorial service," or whatever it might be, because of course death is something that is very much a celebration in Madagascar. The more people that are there at the funeral and the secondary rites, so much the better. And that just made me think, when we came back, that's got to be a research project, and that occupied some of my research time for the next 10 to 15 years.
And so in the last episode, when I was discussing ethnoarchaeology, the point is, you can learn a lot from it. What it usually is an analogy. It doesn't directly tell you, okay, that happened there, so this must have happened here. How would you say you applied those learnings to maybe the British or European prehistory?
Well, I think the first lesson is that it helps you remove those cultural blinkers, that all of a sudden you are open to the extraordinary world of diversity in human behaviour and practices. And that's particularly the case with anything to do with the dead, that you don't realise, I certainly didn't realise really how constrained we were in our kind of logic. of what we would expect, because of not thinking about the huge variety that there exists in the world today. So it's really important on that level. And then analogy works in a whole series of different ways. There are the direct analogies that that if we dig up what we think is an axe, it's a formal analogy to an axe of today. So you can say, oh, this was probably used for chopping down trees. And then you can develop more complicated notions. And I think what had been interesting about Ian Hodder's approach was that he talked about relational analogies, so that you're not necessarily comparing a thing with a thing. It's actually the processes. So we might take more abstract concepts. So, for example, Van Gennep wrote about the rites of passage over 100 years ago, and the idea of time being divided up, particularly in death rituals, between the moment from the moment of death, you have a liminal period, and then a reincorporation period afterwards. So that works as a relational analogy, and you can apply that in many different cultures. And it's broadly a truism. It's broadly a universal, though it's not necessarily an actual rule of human behaviour. So it's working at it in that way. And for me, of course, the Stonehenge breakthrough was really one of those relational analogies, with my colleague Ramili Sonina coming to Britain, and I thought he'd like to see some of our stone megalithic monuments. We'd been studying them, he and I, in southern Madagascar, but he's also from a family of megalith builders himself in central Madagascar. So his very simple observation, which just became the guiding hypothesis for what is now well over 20 years of research. It's been nearly a quarter of a century now. And he noticed, he just said, well, look, surely it's like Madagascar. Stone is for the ancestors, and we build in timber and perishable materials for the living. Is this not what we're seeing here? And I laughed at first because it seemed too neat. But then the more I thought about what we actually knew, it made me realize that actually, yes, well, our Stonehenge landscape does indeed have circles of timber at one end of the river, and a circle of stone, Stonehenge itself, down the other. And maybe he's got a point there. And I think that just led to a moment of, wow, what if? What if that's really the case? And the great thing was, it was a testable proposition. That was one of the great things about the new archaeology, was that you could actually test ideas. So, although I became a post-processualist, I think it was realizing with the fullness of time that we actually embrace all sorts of different aspects of what at the time were the theory wars. Which side were you on and which side were you not? So it was out of that I realized that I had to find out. We could set it up as a hypothesis and a theory, but there were very practical, realistic expectations. If we went to dig where the timber circles were, would we find that they were indeed to do with the living? Was Stonehenge actually not to do with the living? Was it actually where the remains of the dead might be found? And these things were vaguely understood, but there were no certainties at that particular point. And I just thought, well, I'm pretty junior in this world. This was, 25 years ago. It needs somebody senior to go and do that. And sat and waited, and nobody came forward. There was lots of arguing. There was lots of name calling, and people saying that's the worst idea I've ever heard. Others said that's really quite interesting. But by 2002, I realized that nobody was actually prepared to go and investigate that landscape and see if what we were saying was a crock of rubbish or if there was actually some mileage in it.
So let's get right into the heart of the matter, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, as you were. So most people don't realize Stonehenge is part of a whole sort of ceremonial landscape. And what you're referring to just there is Woodhenge, right? Which is something, a similar type of, I guess, construction as Stonehenge, but made of wood, right? It's concentric circles, I think, standing up. And that's a little bit of a distance away. Now, how did you actually get the permission to dig there? And then tell us about the project.
Yes, and it wasn't easy. I think one of the best pieces of advice was a colleague of mine, who's now a professor, Colin Richards, and I'd said to him, Colin, I'd really like it if you were able to join us on the team as a co-director. And Colin said, yeah, that's great, but this is big. This actually needs a whole team of experts, not just the two of us. So, we asked Josh Pollard, Chris Tilley, and Julian Thomas, and latterly Kate Wellham, if they'd actually be part of the management of the project. So I think that was really important in establishing sufficient credentials. And then we were very lucky with the government organisation, English Heritage, which, of course, their job at the time was to preserve and present ancient monuments. Because the Ancient Monuments Inspector was well disposed to what we were doing. We'd also arrived just at the time when the 20th century excavations of Stonehenge had finally been written up and published. There was also a new management plan, a research priorities document. So it was this, everything was in place for a major new initiative of research. We were extremely lucky in just hitting that point in time and having the support. And again, I'd been, until 1990, I'd been myself an inspector of ancient monuments for English Heritage. And it was knowing the ropes, knowing the procedures, the personalities, how you actually get to apply and successfully to dig at a site of international significance. But I won't say it was easy. I've often said if I knew how difficult it was before we started, I probably wouldn't have done it. But there we go, yes.
So briefly, let's hear a little bit more about your interpretation of the site and how that differs from others. If you ask the layperson, I think most people, if we set aside the ancient aliens, most people would say Stonehenge is a calendar, right? When something to do with, eclipses. So what's briefly your interpretation and, the main competing others?
Yes. Well, I think it was the realization that working with Clive Ruggles, who's a professor of archaeoastronomy. And Clive said, well, there are important astronomical alignments at Stonehenge, but the point is they're not precise. Stonehenge isn't an observatory. It isn't a calendar as such. It's merely a monument that is actually celebrating those particular aspects. And he was very critical of the ideas of Gerald Hawkins, whose famous mid-60s book Stonehenge Decoded puts out the idea that it could have been used for solar and lunar eclipse prediction, that sort of thing. And I think it was realizing that it's as a monument that we have to really see its significance. That it's not the temple that people like William Stukeley and John Aubrey thought in the 17th and 18th centuries, that it's it's basically a building site that people come to every few hundreds of years and rebuild and tart up. Yes, for the first half of its life, it is indeed a burial ground. And I think it was realizing that we could actually see it as part of a joined-up landscape, because that really wasn't possible with those older theories, that its significance lay in the connection of Stonehenge to the river. And of course, further upstream, there is not just Woodhenge, but the entire complex of Durrington Walls, which has another 2 large timber circles, and as we were to discover, a major settlement complex. And that itself had an entirely undiscovered avenue, which also had solstitial alignment, not to the midsummer sunrise and midsummer sunset, so midwinter sunset in the opposite direction as at Stonehenge, but in the other direction, midsummer sunset, midwinter sunrise. So it was realizing that these were kind of 2 halves of a single complex was, for me, yes, a massive breakthrough. We'd been trying to study these monuments in isolation, and I think that's where so many interpretations have gone wrong, is they treat Stonehenge devoid of its actual landscape context.
So, in short, it's sort of a ceremonial landscape which is divided into the space for the living and the space for the dead. And this was a place where the Bronze Age people or Neolithic people of Britain would come together. And, you know, its use might have changed over time, but they would sort of reenact some sort of life way.
Yeah. Well, I think we've really got a good handle on the very long term now. And going back over 500 years before Stonehenge was even built, the area immediately to the southwest of Stonehenge just happens to have the densest concentration of Neolithic burial mounds anywhere in Britain. And it's realizing that this is a space that's already got a particular symbolism. And then when, of course, we get to Stonehenge itself, it goes through a series of major building transformations over something like 1,500 years. So it was being able to suddenly we could read that landscape through time. And I think one of the most exciting things was that the prediction of Remy Lissonina, my Malagasy colleague, was to say, well, there's a domain of the living and a domain of the ancestors. So Stonehenge in stone is the place of permanence for the eternal memory of the ancestors. And of course, part of this is also wrapped up with the monumentalization of the astronomy, because it's also relating to eternal movements. And then I think another big breakthrough in 2008, digging at Stonehenge, was the discovery that the Stonehenge Avenue, which leads out on that solstice axis, underneath it, we discovered earlier earthworks on that alignment. And to our amazement, it was the realization that they were not built by people. These were natural landforms that they'd actually modified and embellished a line in the land which was on that solstitial axis. So I think it was that realization that they're doing a number of complicated things, that what's up in the heavens, the moon and the sun's movements, which are eternal, they're also seeing their link to the land itself. And that was a really important breakthrough, as much as finding out that Durrington Walls with its timber circles was actually the place where everybody was hanging out. And I often say to people, for us, Stonehenge is very big and impressive, but for them, all of the huge timber circles, all the houses, and the major structures in wood at Durrington Walls and Woodhenge would have been the most impressive part. We just don't see the wood anymore because it's long gone.
Yep. Well, yeah, I think the interpretation has gained wide acceptance now. I promise I won't cut that bit out. I won't cut that bit cleverly about it wasn't built by people, because that could be an interesting ancient aliens theory.
Yes.
But in any event, you're not working physically on site, but you're still working on the puzzle of Stonehenge. So can you tell us about some of your recent and developing work?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key interests is why they brought the stones from so far away. And it's all of them. It looks like none of the stones are actually local to the site. And that is unique in the more than 800 stone circles in Britain that survive. And you have to ask the question, why was this so important? And I think that really gets to the heart of the Stonehenge mystery, because it's unique for several reasons. Its stones are non-local. It's the only one that has uprights and lintels, and it's also the only one where the stones are actually shaped. They're dressed with hammer stones and so forth. And that inevitably led us to think about, well, why have they come from where they have? For the question of the Sarsens, those are the really big ones, they've actually only come 15 miles, 24 kilometers, and probably from the place where they could most easily get those. We have got recent results that suggest that some of the Sarsens, which are no longer part of the monument, may well have come from further afield within southern Britain. But it's the small blue stones, so-called, that are the biggest puzzle of all. And it was our realization from digging at Stonehenge and going through the old records, realizing that actually those blue stones were most likely there right at the start. So if there was any understanding of the origin of Stonehenge, it had to account for why these were brought 180 miles, 240 kilometres, all the way from the west coast of Britain, from West Wales. And at the time that we started to think about these interesting problems, we were very lucky to meet two geologists who themselves were becoming increasingly interested in this puzzle, Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer. And they said, okay, we're going to start work and see if we can actually tie down where some of these blue stones came from. Blue stone's a generic term. It just means the ones that come from Wales. And they discovered that they could actually locate, first of all, one exact location, an outcrop. And we went out there straight away. I can remember taking Colin Richards and Josh Pollard. We got out the car, and there was this stunning heap of great rock kind of tower, and we said, wow, this is really something. This has to be important. So we started excavation there.
And when was this?
So this was 2011, I think, was our first field season, and very much an initial excavation, very small scale. And then within a couple of years, the geologists had found another source, this time right up on the top of the mountains, the range of the Preseli Hills. And that became a second site to look at. And all the time we were wondering, well, did they really just go straight from the quarries to Stonehenge? What mechanism could there be? And I was all the time remembering the words of a geologist from 100 years ago, a Welshman called H.H. Thomas, Herbert Thomas, who wrote, having identified the spotted dolerite type of bluestone as coming from that part of Wales, said, well, surely there must have been some venerated stone circle that was actually the source that was taken down and moved to Stonehenge. And I always wondered whether he might have actually hit the nail on the head. And we've been looking for that ever since. It's been a long old haul, and we'll find out, hopefully, this autumn, whether there is indeed such a place. We thought we'd found it a few years back, but then we discovered that the stone circle in question was never even finished. And although some of its stones had been taken away, we couldn't be sure that they actually were the stones that ended up at Stonehenge. And in any case, because it was unfinished, there could never have been anywhere near the 80 blue stones that we recognise as having made their way to Salisbury Plain.
So do you have another site in mind in particular?
We do indeed.
Great.
So watch this space.
Awesome. We'll be hearing more about that. So let's talk about the tunnel. So for those of you who don't know, there's actually a big highway that goes very nearby Stonehenge. There used to be roads even closer. So it was decided that I think everyone agrees it's probably a good thing to have a tunnel or something to divert the road away. But the big discussion was whether a short, sort of shallow tunnel or a longer, deeper tunnel, which is, of course, much more expensive. And there's been a lot of back and forth, but recently it sounds like there's been a decision to do the shorter tunnel. How real is that, and what are the risks?
Yes, there were always several options, and one of them that was ruled out right early on. The tunnel question has been rumbling along now for nigh on 30 years. But initially there was the idea of a southern road going around the World Heritage Site, which, for reasons that weren't entirely clear, were ruled out by the Highways Agency. So the short tunnel was really always on the cards. Its length increased by a few hundred meters between the initial formal design in about 2005 and its redesign around 2017, but it was never going to be anywhere near the width of the World Heritage Site. And of course, this has been a matter of grave concern to representatives of UNESCO and ICOMOS, which are both international organisations concerned with the preservation of the world's heritage, because it doesn't look good to destroy a significant percentage of your World Heritage Site. Obviously, it's not going to affect the stones of Stonehenge themselves, but it's the realization that that World Heritage Site is a much larger entity which contains the best preserved prehistoric landscape in Europe, if not in the world. And can we really afford to continue carrying on taking bites out of it like this? Surely the whole purpose is that we should actually preserve these spaces, because otherwise they will die a death of 1,000 cuts, as one scheme creates a precedent for others. I was also, although I've been lucky enough to sit on the scientific committee, which was only appointed because UNESCO insisted on it, because highways and government agencies weren't prepared to do that. So we've been able to at least have some impact in modifying the more extreme initial plans, but still, to my mind, not enough. There are double standards going on. Archaeologists working on research projects within the World Heritage Site are held to much stricter design briefs than the same heritage organisations are imposing for the Highways Agency. And that's not right, because every archaeological intervention should have to work to the same stringent rules that everybody else does. Otherwise, why have a World Heritage Site in the first place? There shouldn't be a shortcut simply because the road lobby is much more powerful than research archaeologists or anyone else wanting to work in the WHS. So yes, it's been a difficult time, and every time that there was a decision not by the government, that decision had been to say, this is not a good application. First of all, the government has 5 planning inspectors who were there at a public hearing to determine whether the proposal should be allowed to go ahead, and they ruled unequivocally no. That was overturned by the minister, the Secretary of State for Transport, and then at a judicial review, the judge again determined that minister had acted unlawfully, but nonetheless with very minor modification of the scheme, not affecting it really in any material way. We're still now back with it on course. It could, and it's supposed to start at any point within the year 2024. What nobody seems to have taken on board is that 4 years ago, the government's National Audit Office, so it's an official part of the government that sits down and does the sums, back then they said this is not good value for money. And if it delays any more, it really shouldn't be going ahead. And here we are 4 years later, and they're still trying to press on with a scheme which is a huge take of the public purse. It was costed at 1.7 billion before COVID. Since then, we've had inflation, we've had a cost of living crisis, and in addition, none of the work is being done by British contractors. It's all being done by Europeans, despite Brexit. So, of course, all that money will be going abroad anyway. And nobody in government seems to realise that it is going to be profoundly uneconomical, as well as heavily biased to the wealthy South and the road industry, whereas we should be thinking about better ways of building our transport policy in ways that benefit public transport rather than private.
And the North, and it doesn't look like that's going to be HS2. So, yeah. So I guess this sounds like a space we should watch. There may be some developments here.
We're coming up to an election at some point likely in this year, and I think there is the very real concern that this government will railroad through the last stages in order to leave a millstone around the next government's neck, knowing that at the moment they have a snowflake's chance in hell of continuing to rule. So my feeling is that this is such an important decision because it will create the largest earthworks within the World Heritage Site, that for future generations, the Stonehenge World Heritage Site, its biggest monument is of the 21st century. That's not how it really should be. And I really think we should be looking at a better scheme. I think a longer tunnel that respects the width of the World Heritage Site is one possibility, but possibly a better one is that southern route. And that you keep the road through Stonehenge. It's very clear that the reason that the traffic is slow is because people like to see Stonehenge as they drive past along the A303. And I think if we do tunnelize it, what it does is it robs people of ever seeing it again without having to pay. Otherwise, it becomes a fully privatized monument. It's supposed to be owned by the people of Britain. But otherwise, really, the only realistic way of seeing it, if there is a tunnel, is if each adult pays their £23.
Yeah, it's not cheap. It's not cheap. I just visited the Roman baths at Bath after 20-some-odd years, and that was a pretty penny. So, yes, understood. Let's spend the last 10 minutes to talk about media, what we're doing here.
Sure.
I guess the advent in this country, at least, of archaeology, mass media, maybe was in the 50s with, what was that, animal, vegetable, mineral. And then, we're all the way up to Ancient Aliens and Graham Hancock's special now. So it's really changed quite a lot. And there's a big divergence of how, let's say, faithful it is to the archaeological practice.
Yeah.
So what has been your experience in media? And then where do you really see it going from here?
Well, I think there have always been the cranks. So that even in the time of animal, vegetable, mineral, weird ideas like ley lines were already there on what people called the archaeological fringe. So I don't think Hancock is in any way, or the idea of, it's space aliens or whatever, is entirely novel. There have always been weird and peculiar ways of interpreting the ancient past, which are widely disseminated and that many people seem to think are the case. My former and late colleague, Tim Shadler Hall, he always had an interesting view on the likes of Hancock and aliens and the rest, because he said, well, actually, we should see those as gateways for the proper interest in the world's ancient past, because what they do is they light a passion of interest and excitement, And then people gradually realize that these are not sufficient explanations, and they start wanting to learn more.
And that's definitely true. I don't know if you know him, but I interviewed a colleague of mine, David, who came back to archaeology in later life and is doing his BA, and
right.
he here at UCL,
Yes.
and he first got interested in archaeology because of Graham Hancock.
So we shouldn't necessarily revile these alternative explanations. We can point them out for what they are, but it's realizing that there will be some fertile ground that they create for people to actually start thinking, I want to find out properly about this. And there, in a way, may come the next generation of archaeologists. I think we had some real soul-searching, particularly in the 1970s. And at every big conference, there'd be a session on public archaeology. What can we do? And for me, that world changed in 1992 when Mick Aston put together Time Team. As I like to say, it changed the culture. Everybody, pretty much, in Britain knew what archaeology was, that it wasn't something to do with gynecology, that even geophysics was something that people actually could talk about.
I think you mean geophys.
Geophys, yes. And that was an extraordinary moment. There was a parallel series on the BBC, because Channel 4 ran Time Team, and that was Meet the Ancestors. So there were these two programs running in parallel, pretty much an episode every week during the seasons in which they were broadcast. And we know that TV is a very fickle thing. Careers don't last long. And yet Time Team went on pretty much since 1992. It was taken off air, but they now have a paywall as a YouTube series. So it's still going. And many of the characters that made it its own particular soap opera are still with it. So it has been enormously successful. But I think we're in another era now, and I think it's a trickier one for us to navigate, because we're seeing really the fragmentation of the whole business of the media, of the visual media. So here we are doing a podcast blog sort of thing. What do you call it really? What is it? Yeah, that's what. Yeah, and of course that's the way a lot of it's going. It's much more independent, but at the same time, it's harder to attract the millions to sit down. And that was the great thing about Time Team, was it hit the million visitor watching number really quite soon, early on, and it really created a culture for people to understand what archaeology was all about and to find it interesting. I think we've still got it carrying on, that Digging for Britain,
Alice Roberts,
with Alice Roberts. She's doing a fantastic job, and there are other media presenters who will deal with archaeology, people like Dan Snow, for example. So it's there, but it's still becoming a bit it's become a bit niche. It hasn't got the huge appeal. Now, it's what we do shouldn't be entirely revolving around the camera. There are other more effective ways of arranging community input and community archaeology, public archaeology in its broadest sense. I think one of the difficulties, though, is that although there have been a relatively small number of organisations that will actually take people digging to do real archaeology, I think that's still an area that hasn't fully gone as far as it can. Part of the problem, of course, is funding. People have to pay sometimes quite considerable sums just to go and do a week of excavation. And I have to compare this against my experience at school and before university. We were paid. We were paid by the state. It was a pitifully small wage, I started on £10.40 a week. But we lived like kings on that sort of money. This was the 1970s, where the price of beer was less than 20 pence a pint, to give you an idea. And it was in those situations that it was available for all. But I think increasingly, as money has to change hands, and sometimes quite a lot of money, it is pricing out a lot of people who are living in times of financially difficult circumstances.
And, with some of the cutbacks in academic programs like Sheffield, where you formerly were, and also in this country, we have commercial archaeology, which I think began with a sort of noble, good idea. And those budgets seem to be being squeezed and squeezed. A lot of that stuff is not published.
Yeah.
Do you have, what do you think about the future of archaeology?
Yeah, because my years at English Heritage, we were actually getting a framework into place for the future funding of archaeology. It had been entirely state-funded well into the 70s, and in my first year of digging in 1972 was when the national budget hit £1 million. A laughably small sum if you think about all the money that comes into commercial archaeology today. But we were in something between a rock and a hard place, because it looked under the Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government that there wasn't going to be a future for 100% state funding to continue. And the way it worked was that the state basically funded different regional units, as we called them, companies, to carry out rescue excavations in their part of England, but they had the same systems in Wales and Scotland. And that was where we worked out that the way to go was to get the local authorities to require developers to make provision for whatever archaeological works, whether it was preservation in situ, whether it was full-scale excavation before development, to actually to do that. And immediately, of course, we pushed archaeology into a world of competitive tendering, because it was felt that if you were putting the developer in the situation of having to arrange for the mitigation strategy, they had every right to choose who they wanted to do the job for how much money, so long as it satisfied the design brief that was set by the local authority. Now, I was very lucky, because I was in that situation that I realised that this all had to be written down, and I actually drafted what would become the government guidance, PPG 16 it was called. My boss said, "Oh God, don't show that to the government, the Department of the Environment, because they'll see this as creating a tax on the developer." But there was a crisis in London. The Rose Theatre, one of Shakespeare's theatres, was discovered in a development, and it was the actors, not the archaeologists, who said, "This is disgraceful." And in Parliament, someone said, "Well, what is the government's policy on archaeology and planning?" So my boss came and said, "Where's that paper that you..."
Wow.
So, "Oh, is it?
Good
Here
timing.
it is." As I blew the dust off, because I'd written it, a year before, and it went through a series of redrafts back and forth between English Heritage, who I worked for, and the government department. And eventually we agreed on a compromise, a form of words that would satisfy everybody. And out it came. But of course, the problem is that I saw this as a temporary advance, that within 10 years we'd actually move to a better and better system, where there was less undercutting as each unit competed against each other for the same job, which of course drives down salaries, drives down standards, even when they're supposed to be imposed by the local authority. And coming back to Denmark, where I'd done my field research for my PhD, it was realizing that they have the best system in the world. And if only we could be like them. They maintained their regional units, which are based on the different museums. So there's total coverage of the whole nation of Denmark. Each museum does a separate bit. So that when a developer wants to develop, and there's an archaeological component in that development, the museum decides what needs doing, how much it's going to be, and that they do it. So it's entirely in-house. So the expertise of that locality, that region, is retained by the organization doing the work. And I was lucky enough to be invited to a museums conference, which is really a rescue conference in Denmark. And the quality and the scale of what they've been doing is breathtaking. They've seen some of the biggest developments in Europe, these huge distribution hubs for the global companies. So they're taking out multiple prehistoric villages within one single footprint, and they're being excavated to the very best of people's ability. And we hear so often in the UK about where commercial archaeology hasn't delivered the quality we want. And it's not the fault of the units. It's all at the level of how the brief for the design is set and the ability to actually ensure that is maintained. So we're not in the best situation, and I'm only sorry that all these years later, and it's now getting on to 35 years, that we didn't have a plan to actually move towards a situation where the very best was done for the archaeological resource. Because once it's gone forever.
Yep. Well, I hate to end on that pessimistic note, but we're out of time. However, we can spin that into a call to arms for all the people now studying archaeology like myself and the future generations who will come up, hopefully inspired by Time Team or Alice Roberts or whatever. So thank you very much for joining me, Mike, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks, Jason.
All righty. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.